All right, I'm just going to do a quick introduction as people slowly filter in. So today we're lucky to have GreenWood Resources joining us. Rich.shuren, Brian Stanton, Rick Stonex, and Jesus Espinoza. And GreenWood Resources has been instrumental to advanced hardwood biofuels. They've been the driving force behind the growing of the poplar trees and the enthusiasm behind this idea of growing poplar trees and using them to create biofuels. And we also have with us today Tim Volk, Dr. Tim Volk from the State University of New York, College of Environmental Science and Forestry, SUNY ESF. And he has been working on the harvesting machine that AHB has been fortunate enough to be able to use to harvest the poplar trees. So he will also be talking with us today. So a little bit about GreenWood Resources, and maybe they will do a little bit about this themselves, but they are a forest investment management company, essentially. So they manage plantations of trees. They also do the science and breeding programs behind trees that they are using to grow for markets. And then they provide investment opportunities for folks. And they are very special in what they do. They are around the world, and I really appreciate the science aspects, but also their willingness to collaborate with other people and their ability to share what they're doing in a way that's understandable to the general public. So I'm very excited to hear what they have to say and hear what has been happening at the harvest of two of our 4 demonstration sites for advanced hardwood biofuels. So at this point, I will pass it over to Rich and company at GreenWood, and anyone who is listening in but is not speaking, I would appreciate if you muted your microphone, just so we don't have any overlapping sounds. So go right ahead, Rich.
Well, good morning. Thank you, Noelle, for that very gracious introduction. So we're here to talk about the final step, harvesting hardwood poplar for renewable biofeedstock for bioenergy. Again, joining us on the phone is Tim Volk from Syracuse University, New York, the College of Environmental Science and Forestry, who will be speaking during the latter half of the program. So let me move to the next slide here. So the Advanced Hardwood Biofuels Project started the first plantings were in 2012. It was a very large grant from the Department of Agriculture and the National Institute of Food and Agriculture. And it's what was called an AFRI-CAP program, a coordinated agriculture program. And the goal of this program, which was led by University of Washington, was to prepare the Pacific Northwest to have a renewable fuel industry based on hybrid poplar feedstock, but not just an ethanol, but actually a drop-in biofuels industry that is compatible with existing petroleum-based gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel. So the fuels that would be produced from the conversion of the hybrid poplar would be indistinguishable from those other fuel sources. Also, a key component of the entire AHB project is to look at and determine ways that we can mitigate the risks of introducing this industry to the Pacific Northwest. So there were multiple teams created under the leadership of University of Washington. There was conversion, sustainability, education, extension, and feedstock. And GreenWood Resources was selected as the feedstock team leader. As such, we were charged with showing that this whole system, this whole hybrid poplar production system, is viable in delivering material to the biorefinery. Obviously, we didn't do this alone. As I mentioned, the entire project was led by Rick Gustafson and his team at the University of Washington. On the feedstock side, we have the New Holland Agriculture equipment manufacturer as a key player. The State University of New York Environmental Science and Forestry, College of Environmental Science and Forestry, helping with the optimization and actual harvesting of the plantations. And then our conversion partner, Zeachem, also played a key role in this whole project. To get going on the project and start the whole hybrid poplar production system, we located and established 4 demonstration farms. 2 of them were planted in 2012, as I previously mentioned. One site in Jefferson, Oregon, in the Willamette Valley of Oregon. one in the panhandle of Idaho near Hayden and Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. The Jefferson site is about 85 acres. It was planted with 11 clonal varieties of hybrid poplar. The Hayden, Idaho site's about 65 acres and was planted with 7 clonal varieties. The following year, 2013, we planted a 98-acre site near Pilchuck, Washington, and then also a 50-acre site in the Sacramento Delta with 9 clonal varieties. And you can see the locations here on the map. These sites were selected for a number of reasons. One of the reasons was that we believed there was an adequate land base to support production of enough hybrid poplar acres to sustain up to a 100 million gallon per year conversion facility, and that was what was in the initial proposal. But in addition to just land availability, if you look at this next slide that shows the distribution network and shipping network for fuel products, you'll see that these sites are also strategically located to take advantage of markets and distribution facilities. The Pilchuck site in northwest Washington has the refineries located near Ferndale and Anacortes. The Willamette Valley site is located on the pipeline between Eugene and Portland, where there are also fuel storage depots. The Hayden, Idaho site, just east of Spokane, is also on a pipeline and near some fuel storage facilities. And then the Clarksburg site in the Sacramento Delta is located near the fuel refineries in the San Francisco Bay Area, which is also a huge consumer of fuels due to the large population in the metropolitan area. So it was both the land availability and the ability to distribute and produce the final product that guided our selection of these sites. And Ziachem and folks at UC Davis were key in helping us select these sites on this basis. So how do you grow these hybrid poplars? It's actually almost like an agricultural crop. The sites are prepared using conventional agricultural equipment, disking, smoothing, ripping for planting rows, and they're also maintained with conventional agricultural equipment. They're planted in monoclonal blocks of about 5 to 8 acres each, and in this photo, you can actually see this is the Jefferson, Oregon site in the Willamette Valley at age 2. You can actually see differences in color and in reflectiveness and so forth that represent the different clones that are planted on the site. The trees are planted at about 1,450 trees to the acre, 10 feet between tree rows and 3 feet between row trees along the row. That allows for equipment and access for doing monitoring and whatever other treatments might be necessary, cultivation and weed control, and also provides adequate room for the harvesting equipment to operate. If it were just a dense planting every 2 square feet, it would be difficult to get any kind of equipment in there. We have inventoried these stands annually for growth and yield. And the cycle on which these have been running, the project is set to run 5 years. We're in our second no-cost extension year in order to complete the rotation of the trials that were planted in 2013. But both the Jefferson site and the Hayden site have been harvested already. So we harvested them initially 2 years from planting. We let them regrow from sprouts that came back for 3 more years, and we call that coppice regeneration. Poplar is an interesting plant. You can actually establish a tree from a stem section, a cutting, or a start, and it will become a unique tree. If you cut it back to ground level, it resprouts very vigorously with multiple stems, actually, and that's the heart of the yield increases that we see in the coppice regeneration. Looking at what we are doing in these sites, Jefferson and Hayden again planted in 2012. They were first harvested in 2013, September and October respectively. They have already been harvested earlier this year, Jefferson in April Hayden in July, and actually restoration has taken place on those two sites as well. They are ready to be turned back to the landowners from whom we leased them. Two other sites in 2013 establishment, they've been harvested at the end of their second growing season in late 2014. Anticipate late winter, early spring harvest and restoration on both of these sites as well. And in fact, our project will actually conclude on August 31st of 2018. Thinking about size distribution of the trees, which is a critical component for being able to optimize the harvesting equipment and so forth, and then the yields that we're seeing. The numbers you're seeing here represent 3 growing seasons from coppice for the Jefferson and Hayden sites, where we did the inventory prior to actual harvest of the stands. Average breast height diameter between the 2 stands was not much very different, and in fact the best clones were not much different than the average. Stem count, again, I mentioned that they sprout vigorously with multiple stems after having been cut back. The average stem count at Jefferson was 2.5, 2.6 at Hayden. Some differences in survival between Jefferson and Hayden, and also in a slight difference in the best survival, as you see in the 3rd column from the right. The interesting component, though, is the yield, and these yields are expressed in bone-dry metric tons per hectare per year. That's what mean annual increment stands for. It's the total yield divided by the number of growing seasons. And so at Jefferson, the average yield of the clones was 13.3, but the best clone actually yielded 18.1 bone-dry metric tons per hectare per year. At Hayden, we saw that the average was 11.8, and the best clone produced 15.7. So it's kind of what we expected when we put out a range of materials that we had a good idea we're going to do pretty well. But again, with any kind of a biological crop, you end up with a range. And as an example, some of the differences between the Hayden average and the Hayden best are obviously embedded in the survival numbers of the average versus the best surviving clone, and also the slightly bigger stems. When thinking about increases over the first cutting at age 2 from planting, the coppice yield, again, these numbers are expressed in terms of mean annual increment. The coppice yields have increased anywhere from 40% to almost 200% of the initial cutting from planting. And also interesting, excuse me, also interestingly enough, the best performing clone at the Jefferson site actually changed rank between the second cutting from 2 years at planting versus the coppice yield. So that was something we'll be looking at. Moving ahead to the harvesting of hybrid poplar. Harvesting and transportation costs can be as much as 50% or more of the total production costs. And sources tell us that they are the top source of greenhouse gas emissions. So, Tim, are you ready to take over at this point?
Sure, glad to, Rich.
Okay. Just give me a nod when you want to change slides.
I'll let you know. Okay, so in terms of developing this system and finding something that would work with these coppice crops, we're really dealing with something that falls in between standard agricultural equipment and forestry equipment. So the sort of sizes that Rich has described are generally not quite big enough for forestry operations, but generally too big for a standard piece of agricultural equipment. And so that's where working with New Holland to develop an alternative type of system that is based on an ag system, but has some changes in terms of how it gets how material gets cut and fed in. So there are limits with these systems, and we've certainly discovered over the years, working on various plantations, what the sort of limits are. So there are size diameter limits. So things less than 6 inches in diameter is sort of a good guideline. There are limits on heights of plants, and I'll mention that again as we go along with the planting configuration that Rich has talked about. If you get plants that are too tall with the tight spacing down the row, it creates some challenges for cutting material and getting it fed into this machine. Okay, next slide, Rich. So what is the system that New Holland has worked on and developed? So you can see here in the picture in the top left, the large part of that piece of equipment is a standard forage harvester. So that's used for harvesting silage crops and hay crops. In the top left, you see the attachment on the front, and this is the piece that New Holland has developed to fit on this piece of equipment, and that's a coppice, what they call a coppice header. So it's really designed to cut woody material and feed it into this forage harvester. Once it gets in the forage harvester, the internal mechanisms in the forage harvester are not any different, and that machine actually has the capacity to chip wood and produce a nice, consistent product out the back end. So one of the advantages potentially here is that back end piece of equipment, the forage harvester, as you can see in the bottom is a picture from a New Holland brochure. You can fit any number of these different headers on this machine, right? So on the far right is the coppice header, and then there's other headers for grass and corn and other crops that can be fit on that same forage chopper. There are a couple other changes that we make to this forage chopper externally to make it effective in these woody crops. So one is, for example, is putting forestry grade tires on the machine. Ag grade tires have are more likely to get punctured in these kind of systems because of the parts of the plant that are left above ground after harvesting. And there's some other guards. There's a plate that gets put in underneath the harvester to protect it, some of the wires and hoses underneath, and some guarding around the glass at the front. But no dramatic changes to the harvester overall. Okay, if you want to go to the next slide, Rich. So this is a schematic of what that coppice header is, and I'll just explain to you basically how this works then, and we'll see a video of it run in a minute. So you can see at the front end, down where the orange part is, there's two large saw blades, and so that's at the front of this header, and that's what's cutting the material. So you're cutting the stems off with that material. The butts or the bottoms of those stems get lifted up and fed in between those two blue towers. They go through those towers, and those towers are spinning, so they're helping to move material into the machine. And then in behind that is this set of feed rolls, and so those feed rolls then catch that material, pull it through those feed rolls into a set of feed rolls in the harvester, and then it's pulled through the machine and through a chipper, and chips are blown out the back end. So New Holland did draw fairly heavily from technology that they have on sugarcane harvesting, and so started with a number of those sorts of pieces, and then made modifications and improvements over the years to make these work in coppice crops. So this has been run in poplar, willow, eucalyptus, locust in different parts of the world. Okay, next slide. So this is just to show you where things are at with New Holland from their perspective. On the left, you can see this is just a snapshot out of one of their brochures for their forage harvester choppers. And this is just making the point that you can put different types of heads on this forage chopper. So you can see a grass head in the top, and down at the bottom is a section that shows you some information about the coppice header. So this idea that you have these one forage harvester, and you've got these interchangeable heads, so you can manage different crops, harvest different crops with it. So on the left, maybe this is the new standard in the world. So there are actually video gamers, farm simulation video gamers that have now made a a version of this New Holland 130 FB. So in these farming simulation games, you can actually plant poplar crops, and then you can go out and buy one of these New Holland coppice headers and snap it onto your forage harvester and actually run it through your simulation game. So, you know, in today's modern world, maybe that's an indication that you've arrived and somebody out there in the video gaming industry is taking notice. Okay, next slide. Okay, so then what do you do with it? So you can see pictures here in the top left of the forage harvester chopping material, and it's blowing out chips. So that's the way this operates. And here are some various different types of collection vehicles that have been used. As we worked and improvements were made in the harvester, right, it became more and more clear that then the limiting part of the system is not so much the harvester anymore, but it's the rest of the system. And we'll come back and revisit that. But one of them is what are the collection vehicles that are available and which ones work the best. And so you've got a silage truck in the top left. Those work fairly well if you can get them in the field. So a lot of these depends on field conditions. And the top right is a small self-propelled collection system. In the Northeast, that's often used for things like green beans. But generally, we found that that's too small a vehicle to be effective. You have to make too many runs with that. It's not got a big enough box. And then down at the bottom is a dump wagon that you might find in an agricultural area. And in the bottom right is actually, this is a sugarcane wagon that's used in the sugarcane industry. So this one in particular was brought up from the southern United States and converted, not converted, it was just and then put into practice and used in coppice systems. So that one's nice for a couple of reasons. One, it's got a bigger box on the back and it has a higher lift capacity. So that cane wagon can actually lift material and dump it directly into an 18-wheeler road truck. Some of the other dump systems do not lift that high, and so then you have to dump it on the ground and then reload it into trucks. So collection vehicles is an issue that's important to look at. Up to this point in time, most of the work has been working on improving the harvester, and so we've largely used equipment that's available from the local agricultural and or forestry community. Okay, next slide. Okay, so the time to think about harvesting is actually when you get ready to plant your field. So this is something that has been learned over the years. Because with this coppice system, you're going to go into a crop and you're going to harvest it multiple times. So after each harvest, it grows back, and you go back a couple years later and you cut it again, and it sprouts back and you cut it again. You're going to be in there harvesting multiple times. So it is important to think about how is this equipment going to fit in the system. So you need enough spacing down the row to get this equipment in. And you can see from this picture that the way these systems have largely been designed to this point is that you're straddling one of the rows of poplar and you're cutting it off. You can see in between the harvester and the tractor, there's another set of previously cut stems in there. So you don't want to be driving over top of those, largely because there are sharp edges and you get tire punctures. So there may be some damage to the plants, but generally, and the folks out of GreenWood could comment on this more for poplar, our experience has been that they take a lot more punishment than we maybe originally had thought. But if you start slicing open tires from harvesters or tractors or wagons, you greatly slow down the process and you greatly increase your cost of harvesting. So spacing is important. The other place where it's important is when you come off the end of the row, like in this picture, you need to have enough space to be able to turn equipment around to get into the next row and turn back in the opposite direction. So not so much with poplar, but our experience in other fields with willow, there's been lots of situations where people want to plant right up to the edge of the field, and then you don't have space to turn equipment, and you just end up creating more headache than you do if you leave 20 or 30 feet at the end of the row for harvesting logistics. The other thing to think about beyond the field is where are you going to do short-term storage, because that becomes a significant cost, right? Moving from the field to some short-term storage location, and you want to have it close enough so that that doesn't become something that delays the overall operations in the field. Generally, the goal here is to keep that forage harvester running as much as possible. It's the most expensive piece of equipment to operate, and you want to optimize that time. But you need to balance it with collection vehicles and the number that you need, depending upon their size and haul distances to short-term storage. Okay, next slide there, Rich.
I think this goes to the video, Tim.
Okay, great.
So, yes. So this hopefully will play. It did before. Hang on a minute. Let me do something here real quick and bring up the video on another program. Okay, let's see if it'll play here. There, should hopefully you're seeing it. This is our AFRI site, again in Jefferson, Oregon, from last February. You can see the 9080 working in the field. Just an overview of the machine. There's a look down the throat. One thing to note here is the plantation density that Tim was talking about, but also the height of the trees. I believe these are among the tallest trees that the machine may have encountered in its work in hybrid poplar. These were some of them were in the 35 to 38 foot range after 3 growing seasons. Here's a full wagon coming out of a field. The next wagon immediately following it up to minimize the delay of the harvester running through the field.
So you can see here with that, well, you can see with that height issue that one of the challenges is that the way this machine feeds is you've got to push those trees over to close to a horizontal level before they feed in the machine. And when they're really tall, that gets to be a challenge.
That is true. So let me go back to the presentation here, and we'll continue on. See that we'll switch back where we were. There we go. Okay, Tim.
Great, thanks. So there's been a lot of data collection that's occurred during these harvesting operations. So we've used GPS units to track vehicles that are collecting collection vehicles in the field, and the harvester. The harvester also has an onboard computer that has a GPS unit, but also collects lots of other information about fuel consumption and engine load and a number of other things. The yield monitor on the forage harvester, we've not been very successful in getting a good calibration for woody crops. It works well for silage crops, but very different materials. So we've done a fair amount of weighing of loads of chips to get ideas of yields and throughput, which is an important parameter. So next slide. This just gives you a snapshot of what a field might look like. So the yellow dots and lines up and down the field are individual GPS reading points. And so you can see the harvester in the top left of that picture coming into the site, and then it's traveling down from left to right to the field. At the other end of the field, you can see there's activity, and then there's bunches where the dots get piled up on one another where things are dark. That's just has to deal with the turnaround that needs to occur at the end of the rows and the slowdown on the machinery. You can see in the middle of the field there with the red arrow, there's a cluster of dots that are stacked together, making a dark area. So this is some delay that occurred down the row, whether it was waiting for a collection vehicle to come alongside, or there was a jam in the material feeding into the machine, or some other issue. For some reason, the harvester stopped there for several seconds, sometimes minutes, and that's where you get that information. We then combine this GPS data with some field notes and some notes taken during the harvesting operation so that we have an understanding of what causes those delays and and what other things might be going on that are important to note across the dynamics of the field. Okay, next slide. Okay, so here's some of the key information on harvesting rates. So the value that we look at that is most enlightening, I think, is what's called effective material capacity. You can think of that as harvester throughput. So that's how many tons, and in this case, these data I'm going to share here are in wet tons or fresh tons, right? How many tons of material are coming out of that spout of the harvester in the form of chips per hour, right? And so in this graph, we see that the effective material capacity or throughput, which is on the y-axis, is strongly related to standing biomass. And so on the x-axis here, we have standing biomass. We also, in the dots here, have two different sets of efficiencies. So the black dots are when the harvester was running 80% or more of the time down the length of a row while it was loading up a wagon. And the white open dots are when there was some delay that caused that number to drop below 80% of the time, actual operation time for the harvester down the row. But what we see here in general is that there's this relationship. As your standing biomass increases, your effective material capacity goes up a bit, but then you start to reach what appears to be a bit of a plateau. And so there is some limit for the harvester here, and it can only put so much material through that system and create chips. So originally we thought that the relationship would be much more strongly related to speed. If we go to the next slide, Rich, we'll see that that's not really the issue. So here's that same graph that I just showed you with standing biomass on the x-axis and effective material capacity or throughput of chips out of the harvester on the y-axis. And so that's the same set of data, and we've just overlaid isolines of speed of the harvester here. And so you can see that when you get up to greater than 80% efficiency and your standing biomass increases, you're actually, the machine speed down the row or hectares per hour actually starts to decrease a little bit. So originally when we started doing this, we really thought the limiting factor was not getting the harvester to go fast enough. But in the reality is that when you start getting really good stands of biomass, the machine can't go faster. It can only process so much material at a given point in time. And with the kind of yields that Rich was talking about, we start getting out there to where that limit is. So on the next slide, we just sort of put this into a schematic. It's the same axes here, standing biomass on the x-axis, effective material capacity or throughput on the y-axis. So in theory, what we have is below 40 or so wet tons per hectare, there is probably a speed limitation. You can only drive so fast down these rows, and so that's why you do have a relationship here between effective material capacity and standing biomass, because you can increase your speed to some degree at that level. But once you get up around 40 or 45 tons per hectare, you're really limited by the size of the crop. And it may go across to the right on a sort of a level like we have there, and you may have effective material capacity that's somewhere between 70 and 80 wet tons per hour. The previous data I showed you suggests there might still be a small increase in effective material capacity as yield increases. So that's something we're still teasing out, but it's not a dramatic increase. There may be a slight increase. And then somewhere out there around where it is exactly, we don't know, 90, 100 tons per hectare, you're probably going to get a drop-off in effective material capacity because you're going to get more delays in the system. And you may actually begin to have mechanical limitations where the crop is too strong for this harvester, this particular harvester. Okay, next slide. So the other thing we've been able to look at, there's lots of other things, but one other item is maybe of interest to people is fuel consumption. So in the top graph here, you have fuel consumption, liters per hour on the y-axis on the top, and engine load on the bottom. So that shouldn't surprise anybody. As your engine load goes up, you have this nice relationship and you're consuming more fuel. When we look at that though and change the variable in the bottom graph on the y-axis and look at it in terms of how many liters of fuel you need to process a wet ton of material, there seems to be an interesting relationship coming out, and that you can see there's 3 different sets of dots in that bottom graph, and they're groupings of standing biomass, less than 50 tons, between 50 and 60 tons per hectare, and greater than 60 tons per hectare. And as you get more tons per hectare, the actual amount of fuel consumed, liters per ton of material, is dropping. And so you get a small decrease, but when you start doing lots of acres, this may become something that is more important than we had originally thought. So higher standing biomass actually results in a little bit less fuel consumed per ton of material that is being chopped. Okay, next slide. Okay, there's biomass characteristics that are important, and these are going to vary with your end user. Most of our experience here on the East Coast has been sending material off to wood-fired power plants. They're very happy with the type of material that comes out of this harvester. It's consistent. The chip size are fairly consistent. You generally do not get a lot of long, stringy pieces coming through this system. The moisture and ash content are fairly consistent across the stand. And those things are important. The variability is as important as what the average values are. And this is something that in the biofuels industry people have learned, is that that's a real challenge. And it's been a real challenge with some other crops, herbaceous crops or ag residues. Generally, with woody crops, the amount of variability is considerably less. A couple of the things that need to be worked on and figured out is harvesting season and timing of harvesting. We've often talked about wanting to do this with material when the leaf matter is off. As you get to more and more acres, you're going to need to balance when you need to supply a biorefinery, and you're going to need to balance when you can get on the field and access the field. So you've got to have conditions that you can drive this equipment on the field. So more recently, we've been doing leaf on harvest and leaf off harvest, and so you definitely have a difference in characteristics there when you start harvesting with leaves on, because then you're putting all that foliage and its associated attributes into your chip pile. So that's something that needs to continue to be worked on going forward, and just matching up the supply of material to meet the expectations and requirements of your end user. Okay, next slide. Okay, so how about costs? This is something that people often want to get down to. And so I'll give you some numbers that we've been working on. These are harvesting costs for material that is delivered to an intermediate storage site. So blown into a wagon, as you can see in the top, and then that material is hauled off to some short-term storage location, and the wagon is unloaded at that site. Okay, so under 10 kilometers, say, for example, to go to that short-term storage site. There's been a considerable drop in harvesting costs by about 1/3 in the past decade, and that's largely been associated with the fact that the harvester has improved, and so it has a lot less downtime down the road where it's sitting idle and not being productive. And so that's made the biggest change in dropping harvesting costs. That also means that you have a lot less time when you have support vehicles sitting around idly and not being productive. So that's where the main changes have occurred. There's a whole host of other factors that, as you improve the efficiency of the harvester and that part of the system runs well, that become important. So what's the field layout, and how big is the crop and how tall it is? We've talked about that as being an issue with some of these fields where some of these poplar trees were in excess of 35 feet tall. The type of collection equipment, so the size of it, how many of them you need to have operating, also has impacts on it. Operator experience is another one of these things that's important. So there aren't that many acres of woody crops available here in North America, and so we've certainly noticed differences because people don't have as much experience working in these crops and want to do things that are more related to ag systems, and it doesn't work here. You can't cut across rows of cut stools or cut plants in a woody crop and expect to not have damage to equipment. Okay, next slide. So I'm going to give you some numbers here. This top bullet is to remind you that that there are challenges in figuring out these numbers because there's limited acreage that we've been able to run on. In some situations, we've been running trials looking at different configurations of the harvester or modifications to the cutting head or the collection system or the push bar in front of it. And so we have not generally run continuously in a production mode for lots and lots of acres to get these numbers. So we take the numbers we have and we are putting them into models to make estimates. And this is what the sort of range of estimates is for harvester operations. Again, this is to harvest and collect and deliver to short-term storage. So this does not include delivery to some end user further away. So $28 to $34, these are in dry tons. So we do these calculations and convert them into dry tons to make them comparable to other types of crops. Okay, so you can easily be up into above $40 a dry ton if you end up with only small collection wagons, for example, and you need more of them than if you had bigger collection wagons. So there are variables, but that seems like a reasonable range for the type of costs associated with harvesting willow and poplar, these coppice crops at this point in time.
Yes, Tim. Just a word on that. We confirm that these numbers are in the range that we've been dealing with as well for our poplar harvest here in the Northwest. Thank you.
Okay, next slide, Rich. Okay, this is just to show you, so again, on the y-axis here, we have throughput or effective material capacity. How many tons per hour is coming out of the machine? Or in this case, we think about it as coming out of the system. So you can see that on the x-axis, we have field speed or in-field activity, delays in the field. So these are delays that might occur as you're driving down the road because of a jam or waiting for equipment. Very little change in the throughput of the system because we've minimized the delays in the field dramatically by improving the harvester and optimizing the collection wagons in the system. You do have a bit of a drop because of turning at the end of the rows. So you do need turn equipment around at the end of the rows. That's not productive time. It may take 30 to 60 seconds if you have good headlands, but it's not productive time, and so you have a drop in throughput. There are delays sometimes in headlands, and this has to do with when you don't have headlands that are set up appropriately, and you can't make a single sweeping turn. You have to pull out and then back up and make a 3 or 4 point turn to get equipment turned around. That slows the process down considerably. This is where squeezing an extra 10 foot of crop onto the field and cutting your headland short does not pay off over multiple harvests. So you can see in the poplar, the data from a poplar harvest in the West Coast, there's a drop there. And then if you, moving it off to dumping is the other next place where you have a big drop. And that's really then setting up a system so that you have the right number of wagons for the distance you have to take material and haul and where you're going to dump it in short-term storage. So the harvester is working well, and I'll talk in a minute. It's not done. There's still work to be done to improve it. But at this point, putting the whole system together is what's going to be important to make it as efficient as possible and therefore as cost-effective as possible. Okay, next slide, Rich. Okay, so there are improvements that can still be done to the harvester. This is a picture on the right taken from in the cab showing the push bar that sits out in front, pushing over some tall, some poplars there. So there are issues related to improving feeding into the machine. That's often where the delays occur now, is getting those stems after they're cut into the machine. And there are times when you get things that bunch up and they clog at the front of the header. There's a number of ideas that people have to try and reduce that and then to improve that flow. That would certainly help move the system along and increase the throughput more consistently. I think if this was to get scaled up, there needs to be discussions about the planning, design, and rotation length and other crop management activities that need to be coordinated in relation to the harvesting. And Rich talked about those, that those are important in terms of the establishment, and I mentioned that as well. So those things just need to be brought together so that the system is designed to optimize the harvesting as well as to optimize the yield that's coming off the field. So though you've got to balance those two factors out. And again, just making the whole system work, headlands, collection points, those things are all important to optimizing the overall operation of the system. Okay, next slide.
So I'll just provide a quick wrap up here, Tim. Thank you for all the information about the harvester, and again, as he said, it needs to be a total picture from planting all the way through harvesting in order to optimize each component to minimize the delivered cost of the material to the biorefinery. So, so what's next for the AHB project out here in the Pacific Northwest? Again, we'll be harvesting the Pilchuck site and the Clarksburg sites in early 2018. We hope to capture some additional time and motion data at the Pilchuck site with the 9080. And at both sites, we'll be collecting some material, providing it to perhaps the Ziachem and also to the University of Washington in their conversion lab for conversion research and improving the efficiency of the conversion process. So, Tim, do you have any final comments? We're kind of at the end of our presentation here.
No, I think I'm good. If there are questions, I'm happy to try and answer them.
Okay. Well, at this point, then, Nicole, I'll stop sharing, and you can come on board and talk about what you need to do, and we'll answer questions.
All right, thank you so much, Rich and Tim Volk. That was an excellent presentation. Before we get to questions, I just quickly want to share, let me see how I do this, share screen. There we go. So we will have another webinar sometime next year, most likely, early 2018, on the restoration process. So even though we called this the final step, harvesting, the final step is if a farmer or landowner wanted to switch crops after having grown poplar, what would the restoration process look like? It's a question that we've had at Extension a number of times. People are a little bit wary about growing poplar because they're imagining having to cut down massive trees and pull up massive rootstocks. So it'll be exciting to be able to tell people what the restoration process would actually look like. And we had an excellent webinar last month that if you missed it, it's on our website now. Just check out hardwoodbiofuels.org/webinars. Dr. Sharon Doty shared her research looking at how you can use microbes in collaboration with poplar trees, so endophytes, to increase its capacity to remove contaminants out of the soil. So if you're at all interested in what we call phytoremediation, I highly recommend that webinar. So at this point, I would like people to be able to type into the chat window. So if you, one second, how do I stop sharing? On the bottom of your screen, there should be a little bubble that says chat if your chat window is not open. If you click on that, please type in any questions that you might have, and then we will have Rich and Tim and company answer those questions for you. So please feel free to type in some questions for us.
Were the cuttings planted manually? Actually, yes, they were hand planted. We ripped the rows with conventional agricultural equipment, and then crews followed up behind using spacing guides to maintain the spacing along the row, and they were planted by hand. And for this particular project, we used a longer cutting than we use in our conventional plantation. We used a 22-inch long cutting just to make sure that we would reach to available moisture and help ensure good survival of the material. Question: how did you end up collaborating with video game developers? Tim, maybe you can answer that one.
Yep, so we didn't actually do any formal collaboration. It's something that they picked up on based on work that was out there, videos that were on the web. So there are about 30 to 35,000 acres of coppice, largely willow, but some poplar in Europe. And so there are harvesting machines and equipment running in other places of the world. And so they just really picked up on that. Actually, some collaboration would have been helpful because there is some errors in the way they represent crop and how some of the thing works, but no formal collaboration. They just picked it up and thought it was an interesting thing to try.
Next question. Researchers have found that leaves into biomass reduce the efficiency of the conversion process. That's true for the chemical conversion to a liquid biofuel. The question is, for willow conversion, do you see the same issues, Tim?
So most of the willow conversion, the end users, the large-scale end users for the 1,200 acres or so of willow in northern New York are both combustion facilities that are generating electricity and producing some waste heat for paper processing. And so no, they don't see a big difference with the green material in there. And typically what happens is that the landowners will hold this material in short-term storage, and in the first few weeks with that leaf material in that, a fair amount of that decomposes fairly rapidly. And so if you have a leaf on harvest, if you're not delivering it right away, you can actually get a fair amount of breakdown of that material and not have as much of it in it when you deliver it after sitting in storage for a couple of weeks.
Very good. Dennis Parent says, are there any growth data available on the poplar sites?
Yes, there will be. We are conducting an inventory at all sites, as Richard mentioned, using the continuous inventory system that GreenWood has developed. We have data for 2 of the sites at Jefferson and Hayden. We are collecting data for Clarksburg and the Pilchuck site. The intent is to prepare a paper for publication under Jesus Espinoza's leadership. I hope that that paper is prepared and submitted before the close of the no-cost extension period, August of this coming year.
Thank you, Brian. How many harvest cycles do you anticipate with poplar versus willow? I'll speak to the poplar side of it. Tim, you can speak to the willow side. Our current model shows 6 harvest cycles, 6 coppice cycles, in addition to the cutting from planting, which could be as much then, if you look at 3-year coppice cycles, could be as much as 20 years from planting to having to replant. We haven't tested anything beyond the first coppice cycle, but we anticipate that these materials are pretty resilient and will coppice back vigorously. That's here in the Northwest. There may be some more evidence in Europe about poplar, but that's here in the Pacific Northwest. How about you? How about your willow, Tim?
Yeah, same sort of, we typically are modeling around 7 rotations. And so with willow, it's a little tighter planting density. And so probably at some point around that 7 rotations or so, we're going to have equipment access into the field because of the spacing. We're now, I think, we have a trial now in its 8th rotation. And so, you know, yield has been maintained over that kind of length of time for the couple of trials that we have data from.
Very good. I'm going to advance back up here, and Bernie is asking, are there clonal differences in coppicing, number of shoots? Are the differences in clonal solely? And asking about the survival at Hayden.
Yeah, good question, Bernie. The data that Richard presented are from the large monovarietal production blocks. I think most of those vary in size from 5 to 8 acres. These were unreplicated, so there's no way in a statistical analysis we could partition out the clonal from the environmental differences. Nonetheless, we expect that those differences in those metrics you've listed here, all of which tie to yield, are in fact genetic, have a strong component of genetic control. What we know so far is that the Jefferson site, the Mesic site, Western Oregon, clones of the Deltoides maximowitzii taxon predominate in terms of yield. In the Idaho Panhandle, more of a xeric site, clones of the Deltoides nigra taxon predominate, although there are some very good generosa clones performing there, Trichocarpa in combination with Deltoides.
Okay. A question for Tim. You suggest the effective material capacity plateaus relative to field inventory. Does the same pattern follow for harvest costs, or do harvest costs continue to decrease with increased field inventory?
Okay, so here's what it looks like the relationship is. So as your effective material capacity or your throughput continues to go up, your cost should drop, assuming that you maintain the same efficiency in the field. So once you get to that point where the field inventory is so large that the efficiency of the harvester starts to decrease because of jams or feeding issues or capacity to process that many tons of chips, then that will change. The other thing that changes along that line is the number of collection vehicles that you have. So in modeling work that Oak Ridge National Lab has actually been doing, at some point, somewhere around when you're getting above 80 or so % efficiency of your collection vehicles, it's probably time to bring another one on. And so at the beginning of that increase in throughput, where you bring an extra collection vehicles on, your harvesting cost shoots up a little bit until the efficiency of use of that additional wagon, gets up above 60% or something. But it's a general upward trend. There's some blips in it as you change the number of collection vehicles. And then I think we have not harvested sites where we've sort of at this 90 or 100 tons per hectare of wet material, standing wet biomass, but I would anticipate that throughput's going to drop and then costs are going to go up in that really high dense material.
Good, thank you, Tim. Question, do you think the efficiency of the harvester would increase by increasing the planting density, and essentially more trees per hectare? I have some intuitive thoughts about that, but Tim, do you have any evidence on?
Give me your intuitive thoughts, Rich. Give us your intuitive thoughts.
The stems themselves would be smaller, but I think you would be looking at feeding issues into the harvesting system that would probably actually reduce the efficiency of the machine. That may sound a little counterintuitive, but your thoughts on that, Tim?
I tend to agree with you, Rich. I think what we're discovering is the limiting factor for feeding is really the height of the material. So if you pack it in tighter and they get smaller diameter and grow taller, it's going to be harder to feed, not easier, which is probably going to reduce the efficiency of the system. So you want to get the biomass, standing biomass, up to your optimum point, but you want to do it at a spacing where you can feed it, and packing more in to make them smaller and potentially taller is maybe not the best solution. Likewise, there's a limit on how far you should space them out too, right? Because then the diameter gets too big to get to the same standing biomass.
Mm-hmm. How about the actual forage harvester itself, Tim? Does increasing the horsepower of the machine improve those situations where the current machines of lower horsepower might be struggling through some of the larger material?
Yeah, so there are 3 or 4 different size engines that go on these forage harvesters, and I think for some of the poplar that was harvested, we did run into a horsepower capacity issue where it could only chip so much material, and so I think running a forage harvester with a slightly larger engine would remove that chipping limitation in the system. And then you're going to have a little bit of a trade-off because it's going to consume more fuel. So if it consistently provides better throughput, that extra fuel consumption gets offset. Again, it may actually drive your liters per ton of material chipped down a little bit if it's being done efficiently.
Okay. I don't see any more questions on the screen here. Oh, wait a minute. Excuse me. There's a comment here from Bernie, and he's asking about, obviously, he's stating that the field layout is indeed critical for equipment and harvesting efficiency. And he's talking about field size in pulpwood systems. And he's asking about the long dimension of the fields. I know when Bruce Summers, who's now retired from GreenWood, was working with our AHB project, he was actually trying to estimate yield per row in such a way that one collection vehicle could capture an entire row and thereby not have to have a collection vehicle staged mid-field, and therefore you would shorten the rows of the blocks in order to accommodate that or meet that requirement. Is there any work going on that, Tim, that kind of scenario or strategy?
Yeah, so we can try and do that, and in some situations where you have field conditions such that you can set the length of row, that may be effective. We did that a decade ago when we started laying out some large fields. We actually estimated it, and then we would put a break in the field, leave a 30-foot strip open so that wagons could pull off and head off the field. Our experience with that is that ended up causing a lot more problems. Now you have this whole strip in here that you have to manage. It gets filled with weeds, which then encroach, 20 or 30 feet into your crop. And it really was hard to get a consistent estimate of where that strip should go. So I don't think that you may be able to do it with a more consistent field condition. The other thing we found with fields in the Northeast, where we have a lot of relatively small fields, it's the connections between those fields that's important. So if they're connected and there's access easily between one field to the next, those shorter runs are less of a problem. If you've got a little 10-acre field and your next nearest field is a 5-minute drive down a road or across the set of other fields, then that's the problem. It's too disconnected from other things.
Interesting. Good. Okay. Noel, we'll turn it back to you.
All right, well, once again, I just want to thank especially Rich.shuren and Tim Volk, who's joining us from SUNY ESF in upstate New York today and giving us a talk on the status of what we've learned about the harvesting system here in the Pacific Northwest. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me, noel.hart@wsu.edu, or I'm sure the speakers would also be happy to answer questions. We will be posting this recording hopefully later this week or early next week. So if you want to listen to it again, it'll be available, or if you know anyone who missed it who wanted to see that. And again, we hope to have a webinar sometime in the late winter, early spring of next year on the restoration process if you are interested. So thank you, everyone, and have a fabulous day.